Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining this morning's webinar. It's a lovely rainy day outside, and I'm grateful that our skies and our air is getting cleaned. We have a record-breaking 186 registrants for this webinar today, which is very exciting. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional Indigenous lands that we are living, working, and playing on. Here, the Actsafe office is located on Squamish, Stallow, Keekite, Tsleil-Waututh, and Chemainus land. And I'd like to encourage you following this session to visit Native Land digital website at native-land.ca and search the territory on which you are located. So my name is Trina Pollard, and I'm the CEO at Actsafe. I'll tell you a little bit about Actsafe and then we'll get this party started. Actsafe is a nonprofit health and safety association that's been around since 1998. So next year will be our 25th anniversary. We support BC's arts and entertainment industry. So motion picture, performing arts, live events, and with everything from resources, services, and training, serving employers, workers, and supervisors. So we have over 23 courses, everything from occupational first aid level 1 to our infamous motion picture general safety awareness, and also our motion picture for supervisor course is one of our top rated. Highly recommend both of those, and they're free. And on our website, you'll also find resources. So lots of educational resources, but lots of practical ones too, templates, policies, checklists, not only to sort of help you learn, but also to make it really easy for you to lead health and safety workplaces. We also have a couple services. So one is consultation. So my safety advisor team can come out to your site. They can help do a gap analysis of your safety program. They can build your safety program for you and with you. At any time, you can call or email my team with any questions you have. And then we offer some specialized services. So we offer an AED rental program, respirator fit testing, as well as hearing and sound testing. And we'll be expanding that program next year. So we'll be offering even more services. Two other big parts of Actsafe is our annual campaigns. And so this week is actually our big Actsafe Injury Prevention Week. And my team and I have been out at various different locations at studios around the Lower Mainland, with a coffee truck, talking to a lot of workers, many of you most likely on site. And finally, our annual conference and safety awards gala. That we're still sort of fine-tuning the date, but it will most likely be in spring. And we generally get about 150 to 500 attendees. So we offer a lot, and I really encourage you to leverage these services and our support whenever you need it. So without further ado, today's webinar is on emergency preparedness and response planning for arts and entertainment workplaces. And as I mentioned, it's part of this week's Actsafe Injury Prevention Week. It's sort of the culmination and the end of it. We'll have you here for about an hour until 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll first hear from Steve Wallace, our guest speaker, who will be speaking about preparing and planning for emergencies for about 30 minutes. Then it'll be followed by Will Heller, who will be orienting all of you to our brand new resource, an emergency response plan template. And for Will's presentation, we recommend you have a second device available because it's going to be interactive. So if you can make sure you have a cell phone available or an iPad, we'll give you a QR code to scan so that you can participate in some quizzes and fun activities. Then we will end with a 15-minute question and answer period. So if you do have questions, we ask you to put it into the Q&A section of Zoom. With this many attendees, there won't be time to answer your questions throughout the presentation, but at that final 15 minutes, I'll be going through and choosing a bunch of questions to answer. There's closed captioning available on your screen, and we are recording this webinar. We will be posting it to the website and sending it out after. And you will also all receive a survey, so you can help us continue to improve how we're serving you. So with that, I will introduce Steve. So we are thankful to be joined this morning by Steve Wallace, CRSP, NP, run through a whole bunch of acronyms here, CSP, CSO, SHOF. With 42 years in the safety field, Steve has worked in many different industries: mining, manufacturing, emergency response, and for safety associations like Actsafe, as well as academia. So he's currently the co-owner of Wallpro Enterprises. And in his community, he's a volunteer fire chief and emergency measures organization committee member. Throughout his career, he's volunteered with numerous safety associations like he's doing for us today, and various committees. So Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Trina. Yeah, what I'm here to do today to talk is preparing for emergencies, drills. Really, I'm an adult. I'll go in a little bit more of the second part of the title a little bit later on, but one of the things that's happening in our world right now is, the need for emergency response has always been there, but it's getting more and more pertinent. And, some of the things we're having is more extreme weather events, and whatever the cause is, I don't want to get into that sort of stuff. But what we really need to do is we need to be more resilient so we can handle these sorts of things. So we're going to talk a little bit about, what are emergencies, what do we need to do, that sort of thing. So my goal is hopefully by the end, I'll give you a good overview, and then we can lead into Will's presentation on the template that Actsafe has developed for emergency response planning, which should be awesome for you guys. I want to start off by, talking about what an emergency is. And in the simplest terms, it is an incident that, we have one or more of the following sorts of things taking place. So we have either an immediate threat to somebody's life, to their health, their property, or the environment. So, like if somebody's in a motor vehicle collision, if somebody falls, if there's a massive flood, those are all things could impact those four areas. The other thing is if it poses immediate threat, or it could also have already caused loss from one or more of those areas. So those would be what we would consider emergency. And the last one is it has a high chance of escalating. So in other words, we haven't had any loss of life, we haven't had anybody hurt, we haven't had any property damage or the environment, but things are pointing to that we could have an escalation when we get to that point. So, we want to establish what is an emergency. Now, one of the drawbacks I guess you're going to have is because of the variety of things you guys do within your industries, it could be various things. So your emergency response plan has to reflect the type of emergencies you folks face. So if we take a look at our emergency response plan, what is it? It's going to be, and I always like to say, usually in writing. You can have a plan without it being in writing. It's better if it is in writing. But what we would have is some of the following things. So we might have a list of our potential emergencies, and we'll spend some time going over what those are. But what you're talking about is what are the things that could go wrong within your organization where you are working. And once you have that, then you can move forward and you can take a look at things like what resources do you have internally to handle with those. So whether that's your own firefighting capability or your own emergency response for medical emergencies, what do you have available yourself? Is it adequate to meet the list of potential emergencies you have? Then what do we have for external resources? Now, this is where I want to say the next one is calling 911 is not an emergency response plan. And what I mean is, if you are sitting in Vancouver, the capabilities of the Vancouver Fire Department are going to be very different than the actual capabilities of another department, sort of thing. Hang on a sec. When you take a look at that, what we need to be aware of is what is the abilities of our 911 responders? What is the ability of our healthcare responders? What is the ability of our police department? What is the ability of our fire departments? And depending where you are within the province, it's going to be different. So like I said, Vancouver Fire Department is going to have a different response than I'm currently sitting in Revelstoke, BC, than Revelstoke's department. Vancouver is a full-time paid on-call department. Revelstoke is a combination department. So they have a number of people who are on full-time permanently, and then they have a number of volunteers. So what you need to do is, if you're in a given area, you have to touch base with those emergency responders to see what is it that they can do and provide for you. And once you have that, that's going to go a long ways to helping determine what you can actually do. So some of the other things I want to, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time at this, but I want to talk about hazard versus risk, because sometimes people think they're one and the same. And really what hazard is it's that thing that has the potential to cause you harm. And whether it's injury, illness, property damage, environment damage, that's the hazard. The risk is how likely is that hazard to cause you that. So the example I'll use, which may not be a good one for Vancouver, but from where I come on the prairies, we're coming into winter, we're going to have slippery season soon. So a hazard would be an icy road. The road is the hazard. What is the risk? Well, if I go to Hawaii for 6 months, there's no risk because I'm not on the icy road. If I can choose not to drive that day, there's no risk because I'm not on the icy road. So we can see that there's the hazard and then there's the actual risk. Now, if I choose that I have to drive on an icy road, there are things I can do to minimize or mitigate the risk. So I could make sure my car is in good shape. I could make sure my car has actual winter tires. I can make sure that maybe I've done something like taking a winter driving course so I know how to handle winter driving conditions. So one is the hazard, the icy road. One is what am I going to do to either eliminate or minimize the risk of those sorts of things. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. That's where your safety association, Actsafe, can help you with those sorts of things. So now I want to take a look and talk a little bit about some of the responsibilities of what you're going to have. So on the screen, I'm showing, it's generic. It's actually for an organization I work for, the Saskatchewan Safety Council. It's their emergency information diagram. Now, I'm going to use that as a way to talk about responsibility. So if you take a look at management, management's going to be responsible to make sure that emergency plans are created and implemented. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean management has to write them. It just means that they have to make sure that they are developed and implemented. Now, as we move down the scale in the organization, the supervisors, they may be involved in helping to write the program, but their main role is to make sure that it is implemented within the workplace. And again, because we don't have a lot of time together, the employees or workers, their goal is to be aware of the emergency plan and to actively take part in whatever role it is that they are assigned. So that in very quick order is what we're looking at. Now, one of the problems when you get into emergency response is there's always legislation, but it's not one set of legislation. So what you might take a look at is we might have something like the National Fire Code. So the National Fire Code is going to outline such things as, you're going to need a fire plan, what you're going to do for firefighting, what do you have for life safety? And it's going to be closely integrated within the National Building Code, which is going to set standards for our buildings so that, again, what do we need for firefighting, size of exits, number of exits, all of those sorts of things. So those two pieces of information go hand in hand. Do you need to get a copy of them? No, if you get in touch with your local fire department, whoever is the authority having jurisdiction within your area. So quite often there might be a fire marshal. Well, if you've got questions, you can go and talk to the fire marshal in your area. Now, if it's a small town fire department, you might not have a fire marshal, but you could always contact the fire department, and it might be the fire chief you're talking to, and he'll go over what is necessary for you to do in those cases. Really important, BC's WorkSafe OHS Act and regulations. So when I say it's really important, in most cases, the OH&S Act and regulations carries more weight and it's more easier to enforce than some of the other things we just talked about, like the National Fire Code and Building Code. They're all important, but usually our occupational health and safety jurisdictions, they have much more greater powers of being able to do things. So it's really important to be aware of what they have to say about, emergency response and first aid and fire safety and all that sort of stuff. You're likely going to have a BC Fire Safety Act. It's going to have some stuff to say about what happens and what takes place. So for example, in Saskatchewan, our Fire Safety Act gives me the authority as fire chief to do a lot of things when there's an emergency, and it gives a fair amount of power. BC is going to have something similar. So what does that have to say if there is an emergency going on? We're also going to have an organization based out of the States, the National Fire Protection Association. They set standards for things like fire extinguisher, fire trucks, turnout gear, a whole raft of different things when it comes to emergencies, specifically relating to fire. Again, you don't have to necessarily know all of them, just be aware that they exist. And if you have questions, again, talk to your local fire department. They can actually assist with that. And then the last and not least is municipal bylaws. Again, you might be in a small town and they're not going to really have a whole lot to say about these sorts of things. However, you might be in the city of Vancouver and they might set a whole bunch of rules and regulations. One of the things, and I didn't put it on here, but I'll get the name wrong, but Explosives Canada. So for example, I do not have a pyrotechnics ticket, but I do have a level 2 fireworks ticket. What's the difference? Well, one's bigger and one's smaller. One's designed to be viewed up close. One's designed to be from a farther distance. They will have requirements what you need to do if you're going to use these devices. But the municipality will also come in and they might impose other things. So you need to be aware that there are many different pieces of legislation that could affect what you're doing when it comes to emergency response. Now, I want to talk a little bit about drills and that sort of thing. So when we talk about drills, why do we do a drill? And in short answer is, it's a way of us being able to test our emergency response plan. So if we've got plans laid out, that's awesome, but how do we know they're going to work? So that's why we may actually conduct a drill. Now, we can conduct different types of drills, but within that wide drilling, there's also, by doing training, by doing different tests, we can assess our employees' competency as to how well can they handle an emergency. So that's a very important reason of why we might do drills. And again, depending on your legislation, it might require that you have to do some sort of an emergency drill or a fire drill every year or 2 years or whatever the case may be. So this is why we drill. But what could a drill be? Well, a drill could literally be actual training. And we're going to actually set, it's a real fire in this case, but it's a scenario, it's a training scenario. So they have to use the equipment, deal with the emergency, and go from there. So we could have training. It could also include, you might not be able to do an actual live thing. So you might do a tabletop exercise. So you run through the emergency, who's going to be responsible for what's going to happen, what's going to take place. So if you can be doing that sort of thing, then that's going to happen. So there's different exercises you can do, you can plan, and it's called tabletop because you gather around the table and you sort of say, okay, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, this is our plan, this is what happens. Because there are times that you might be in a location, and I'll give an example in a few minutes from now, that it may not be possible to do an actual drill. You may have to do a tabletop exercise. We might actually have, and I'll talk briefly about it again in a moment, an evacuation. If something goes really horribly wrong, from a life safety point of view, we want to get people out of there and we want to be doing stuff. So if we can get people evacuating, that might be part of our fire plan. We might have mock drills. So there are some industries like the mining industry, they will put on annual mine rescue competitions. What it does is it allows their teams to train for a goal, which is to go to the mine rescue competition, do it. We also have first aid teams that do the same thing. So they try to make as realistic as possible scenario, and they will actually have, casualties, and they have to actually run through the thing like as if it was real. And then they're judged and ranked on how well they did. And the last one that we could have could also be an actual event where We have emergency crews respond to something. Now, at the time they're responding, they don't necessarily worry about evaluating it until after the fact. So this was a house fire that my little department went to last year. The last fire I was at was last week. It wouldn't be something you guys would have, but we had a grass fire that was being fanned by 80 to 90 kilometer per hour winds. We were lucky that we got it under control within about 3 to 4 hours, and then spent another 3 or 4 hours cleaning up and then going back the next day to deal with hotspots. So once you've had the actual event, you can then sit down and sort of say, hey, what went well? What could we do better? How could we make these things perform better? That's what we're looking at. That's what we're after. So I'm going to take some time and talk about some of the more common types of incidents we may have. So we may have first aid. So it's great that you have first aid kits, but what level of training do you need? Now, that could be based on what is your first aid hazard. So if we have somebody in a performing arts center and it's a concert, well, the chances of severe physical injury, I mean, somebody could trip and fall and that could make a severe injury, but it's going to be a little less than if, let's say, we have a theatrical production where they're using pyrotechnics, they're flying off of aerial rigs. So the hazards present in one are a little bit different than the other. So you want to try and design your first aid program, how much equipment you have, based on what the legislation says and what is the hazard that is presenting. So that's what you want to try and take a look at and make sure you're able to deal with. Fire is the same thing. Again, in our standard theatrical setting, it's going to be designed according to the National Building Code. There's going to have to be X number of exits. There's going to have to be fire extinguisher or firefighting equipment every X number of feet or meters to meet those requirements. So that's what you're taking a look at. But if you do something that's a higher risk, you may need to have extra firefighting equipment, and you may need to do that. Now, just to also bring forth the importance, and this is a fire issue, but when 9/11 happened a number of years ago, what we took a look at, I think it's 20 years since it actually happened, this gentleman died in the actual building collapse. What makes him so remarkable isn't that he died, but he was the head of security for Morgan Stanley. They got 2,687 of their staff out. Only 7 perished in the collapse. He was one of them because he was going back into the building to make sure everybody had gotten out. What was really amazing was he was a stickler for drills. If they had a drill scheduled, you took part. Didn't matter if you were the CEO and you were on an important call. If the drill was called, he would make you leave. And you can sort of say, wow, the guy must have been a real downer or a bummer. No, his actions and his dedication allowed that the vast majority of those people, when the tower collapsed, to basically escape and get out. So we think, or I think, a lot of the emergency services drills are important because all of the things I just finished outlining. So that's what we were looking at to try and do. If you have an evacuation drill, there can be different types depending on the type of structure or building that you are in. So for example, you could have a total evacuation. If the building has exits and adequate, just the alarm hits, everybody exit the building. That's the ideal. But you have to understand, depending on the size of the building and type of emergency, you might have a staged evacuation. So if you have a tall high rise and you have an incident or a fire incident on a given floor, the staged evacuation, they may only be able to handle so many people in the exit wells. So it might be that the actual floor the emergency is on, the floor above and below, are initially evacuated. Within a few minutes, then they start evacuating others. So we can have total evacuation, we can have staged evacuation. We also have defend in place. So when we have healthcare facilities, it's not always possible to get them all out. Now the buildings have to be built to a different standard. They must be sprinkled. There's a whole bunch of things that take a long time to talk about. The other place we have defend in place is prisons. They don't open doors and let them out if there's an emergency. So they have a defend in place process of how they deal with that. So you need to understand that. Also, you need to understand that if you have alarms within your building, what type of alarms are they? Are they a local alarm or are they a monitored alarm? The difference being a local alarm is you pull the pull station and the alarm rings, but only in that building. If it's a monitored alarm, there is a monitoring service that monitors it. It's important to know because if I'm in a local alarm building, I still have to call 911. In a monitored alarm, we may still want to call 911, but the actual alarm service will also do that as well. So you need to know those sorts of things. Now, I'm talking about fairly typical things. Now I want to talk about some untypical things. So if you take a look at natural events, again, the natural events I'm familiar with are going to be a little bit different than what you guys would have on the West Coast. But for example, in 2011, Saskatchewan, we had a very wet year. I live about 50 clicks north and west of the city of Regina, and I live in a valley. I know that's hard to believe for people in BC because Saskatchewan, as you know, is all completely flat, but it's not. So the valley, the Quail Valley has been there for a long time. It was carved by the glaciers retreating, and they carved out this big valley that spans most of the province. When the hills get wet, if it's at its normal level of moisture, they're very stable. But in high water years, the hills will start to move and slump and cause problems. So the flooding is a natural event. The damage that comes from slumping can be other things. It's not mudslides like what you guys get, but there's some things. Now, the other thing is, then about 3 years after, on December 3rd, there was a massive explosion across the lake from where I live at a place called Regina Beach. And what had happened was gas lines had ruptured and it blew up the post office. Thankfully, it was at noon and nobody was injured. Just happened. Nobody was around at that point in time. So that was good. But people say, well, that's not a natural event. Well, it is and it isn't. It was a natural gas that had been put in, but had the hills not had all that moisture and started moving, the natural gas pipelines would have been fine. So our natural events can be a lot of different things. Now, this one is one you probably won't get in Vancouver. This is a prairie blizzard. You get 0 things. It's something that happens regularly. So you need to be aware of what are the natural events could cause. Like, for example, Regina very seldom gets earthquakes, but we get a lot of high winds and that sort of stuff. Whereas someplace like Vancouver, you guys can get earthquakes. You can also get storm surges. I don't know if it was further up, but you guys can also get tsunamis. So the natural events you guys get can be a little bit different than what we would face. But the idea is to be aware of what are the natural events and what do you need to do in response to that. That's what we need to take a look at. Another growing concern we have is violence. Now, in 2014, Corporal Nathan Cirillo, he was shot at the Cenotaph. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Ottawa, but the assailant, and I don't know if you can see my arrow, he drove up to this area here, ran out, shot Corporal Nathan Cirillo, got back into his car, drove up to Wellington, and then he drove to the Parliament buildings. Now, when I first heard it, they said he drove right onto the Parliament buildings. I go, well, I've been there a number of times. You can't just drive a car on. But what he did was he came up, stopped, and I'm not sure if he went in this walkway or this walkway, came onto Parliament Hill, commandeered a vehicle, drove all the way up to the Parliament Hill, and Parliament Hill is sort of secure. And what I mean by that is if you're the general population and you are a regular Canadian who follows rules, you would get to this point, you would go beside the main entrance at the Central Tower, and you would go into the basement and you go through security screening like an airport. What he did was he ran up the front steps through the front doors, which they don't have heavily secured so that the politicians and media can walk in and out without having to have a whole lot of delays. That's how we got into the building very quickly. So when we start taking a look at security issues, we need to be aware that a lot of things we can deal with, but how much do we want to have our personal freedoms infringed on? So can we stop this from happening? Absolutely. But you're going to have to change how some things happen. And that's already taking place. In 2016, I believe the LCBO in Ontario, they passed a policy, which is good for their workers. If somebody was shoplifting, they didn't want their workers to confront the people, just let them go. What that did is, and it continues to this day, it's led to some very brazen thefts. Can they stop them? Yeah, but what they would have to do then, and they've taken some steps, really, really high value, expensive liquor products, they put on higher shelves or they have them behind locked cabinets and you've got to request them. So all these things that are happening in our society If you went back 30 years ago, there wasn't violence, but it wasn't the same. So, we're going to have to take a look at as a society, what are we prepared to do to stop these things? But you need to be aware of what is the risk of violence? How can we control things? One of the things I find now when I go to a lot of major companies, either I'm buzzed in and I got to do an orientation or whatever, and to get out, I got to push a button to exit, or I'm actually given a magnetic key card or an electronic card that allows me access, but it also is assigned to me so they know where I am, if I'm in the building, if I'm gone, all of that. So we're starting to see some electronic solutions to some of these things to try and do that, to make sure that the right people are in the right place at the right time. So I would just like to finish up with a couple stories. How the title of this thing came about, Preparing for Emergencies Drills, Really I'm an Adult. In 2006, the Saskatchewan Safety Council, they host the oldest safety conference in Western Canada. This year, or in 2023, it'll be the 50th anniversary. In 2006, we decided we would do an actual live drill. And we were at Teachers Credit Union Place, which is a performing arts center. Now, these are places that don't normally do actual fire drills. They'll do tabletops, because if you've got a performance going on, you don't want to say, well, let's have a fire drill and see how quickly people will get out. That's where tabletop is really important. So they really welcomed it. Now, we also involved City of Saskatoon Police and Fire and said, this is what we're going to do. So they took some steps that normally wouldn't happen. So they knew about when it was going to happen. The police had the intersection closed off for us. The fire department came in, did their normal thing. And I believe with the fire department, they didn't tell them it was a drill. They wanted to see how they would respond in the actual emergency. And what we did was we had speakers going on, and our muster point was across the road from this Teachers Credit Union. So we had almost 700 delegates, 100 plus staff and speakers, and we got them out of this building to the building across the road. Now, in Saskatchewan in February, it's a dry cold, but if it's minus 29 and you don't have a park on, it's still cold. We had another session planned in this building where we would actually go and talk more about fire safety. We actually thought it was a good situation. We had virtually everybody out within minutes, and the majority made it to the muster point. I believe by our count, there were 6 that did not make it. Where the title Drills We Really Were an Adult, we had a safety professional complain to us. Had we informed him it was a drill, he would have showed up to the muster point. And we tried to explain to him that that wasn't the point. The point was to see how quickly we could get everybody out of the building. And his comment was, really? Drills, we're adults. Do we need to do this? And the short answer is yes. If we take a look at who in our society is the very best at performing drills, it's K to 6, kindergarten to grade 6. And why are they good at it? They don't question whether it's real, whether it's practice, or whether it's a drill. If they're told to line up 2 by 2 and hold hands, they line up 2 by 2 and they hold hands. Once you get past grade 6, 7, now we come a little bit too cool for school. And, we'll know if it's real for sure. No, people don't. So that's why we try to hold drills, to see how are people going to react. The really good thing for us was it allowed us to see how it went. TCU was very happy because they had plans. They did regular tabletop drills, but allowed them to see what would happen. So they didn't have to scrap their plans, but they made some minor tweaks after they saw a real evacuation within their building in real time. So that was a phenomenal thing. That was good to see. And the really good thing, it was also talked about for years. Everybody goes, are we going to have a fire drill this year? It took about 10 years before they quit asking that question. This was not a drill. This is probably the biggest event I ever dealt with as a volunteer fire chief. This took place May 7th, 2018. It's a memorable date because my third granddaughter was born May 6th, 2018 in Revelstoke. So I didn't sleep a lot that night. And then the next night I thought, I'll get some sleep, and this alarm hits. We had 7 fire departments using mutual aid, including our provincial organization, SPSA, 13 fire trucks, 80 firefighters, and 4 pieces of heavy equipment. What we were actually looking at in this event was we had an 8-kilometer long fire line within 10 minutes. We had 14 plus properties that were impacted by fire. It involved 2 rural municipalities, 6 villages. And what we were actually looking at, unfortunately, was we lost 3 residents. But we actually had 400 to 500 residences threatened. So it was a horrible incident. I didn't sleep a whole lot for the next 3 days. It wasn't until Wednesday night. This happened on a Monday night. It wasn't until Wednesday night that I finally got to sleep. Now, some of the highlights, if you will, we received our first dispatch at 4:24. We were on scene at 4:34. If you just recently seen the W5 episode about fire departments, and they were talking about, geez, we should maybe have, more firefighters sitting in the fire hall. It's great. The problem that you find in the rural area is we wanted to have a $5 increase to our annual fee, and people freaked out. We could have firefighters full-time at the hall. It would just raise their fire fees, not by $5, but by about $1,200 to $1,500 to have firefighters sit at the fire hall. So one of the realities is, if you're living in the rural area, it's going to take 5 or 10 minutes to get people to the fire hall. And then it's going to take another, depending where you are, another 5 or 10 minutes for them to get there. So 10 to 20 minutes isn't unusual. Whereas in the urban setting, unless they've got a major traffic jam, they're usually there within 3 to 9 minutes. So the other thing when you're thinking of emergency response, if you are in a rural area, find out what their typical response is. If somebody calls and tells me, I said, it takes us 5 to 10 minutes to get guys to the hall, and depending where you are, another 5 to 10 minutes to get there. So you might be on your own for the first 10, 20 minutes. Are there things you could do to make sure people are safe and they're going to be okay? That's what we were after. Fortunately, we had it under control by about 8:05. We continued working on hotspots. Now, when I said that, one of the things we learned from it was some of the building codes should be revised. We told the villages, maybe don't allow wooden shingles. They're beautiful, they last a long time, but they catch fire really, really, really easy. We said build better fire breaks. We had some pushback from some environmentalists. They said, we want the bush left natural. So I said, the problem with that is if we don't build fire breaks, I said, if the fire goes through, the grass will regenerate, the trees and the bush will regenerate. I said, your house will not naturally regenerate. So I'm okay if you don't want fire breaks, as long as you're okay that we'll write off these 60 houses. And they go, well, no, you're there to fight the fire. Yeah, but if we have that big a fire, it can be a challenge. So, there was things like that we came up with. We also discovered people, I don't know if it's YouTube, they thought the best thing to do is stand in the middle of the road and watch us do our job. Unfortunately, we can't get to the event. So we deemed that we needed better traffic control. And from my perspective, if you have my phone and you go to the F's, it's fire this, fire that, fire this, because while we had it all written down in a book, I didn't have it with me. So on my phone, I always have all my most critical. There's about 30 or 40 fire numbers I have that are programmed into my phone. Now, just to sum this up, what I would like to do is talk about some checklists. For you guys, what you need to do is, again, we're just restating this. What are the potential emergencies you have? What resources do you have? What resources do you need? Whether that's getting some additional internal resources, or what can your external providers provide for you? And lastly, how do we provide your plan? And I would just like to take a minute to talk about personal, because again, in this day and age where we're having more hurricanes, power outages, all of that, if it's personal, if you got to evacuate, do you know where your family are at any given point in time? Do you have a vehicle with at least a half a tank of fuel or at least 50% charge if you've got to get out of that area? Do you have an emergency kit ready? Now, I'll just quickly go through what I have, because a lot of this is also covered in your emergency response plan. So you should have a 3-day supply of water, 4 liters per person per day, 3-day supply of food, candles, stove, matches. When we say stove, like a gas stove or something like that. Do you have a first aid kit? Do you have a flashlight and radio, battery powered or hand cranked? Do you have spare keys? Do you have things for cleaning? Do you have spare glasses and contacts? Do you have any family documents, contact numbers, etc.? Prescriptions. I'm at that age where I have prescriptions. Well, make sure you got your prescriptions with you. In this day and age, do you have chargers for your electronics? Do you have passports and financial documents, money, credit cards, change of clothes with coats. When you do this in the summer, people go, why do you want a coat? Well, it could rain, it could get cool, all that sort of stuff. And lastly, if you got time, family photos and other valuables, personal computers, hard drives, etc. So if you want to get a hold of me, and they'll give this information later, that's my name, that's my phone number, and that's my actual email. If you have a question, I would only ask that you sort of said, hey, I saw you at Actsafe's thing on preparing for emergencies. I have a question. And then that way I can do my best to try and get back to you. Ideally, if the question is easy for me to answer, I can get back to you with an answer, whether I text you or email you back. So anyways, thank you for listening. I know this is rather quick. We would normally take probably for some of this stuff 1 to 2 days. So I will now turn it over and go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that great presentation. I liked your comment that 911 is not an effective emergency response plan. I like learning about the different types of hazards and risks, the different types of legislation, different responsibilities in the workplace between employer, supervisor, worker, and all the different control measures that we should be thinking about as we're planning for these emergencies. So Steve will be, as he mentioned, this was just a little appetizer of a presentation because we just had 30 minutes, but he will be at the Western Conference on Safety in May, which is in Vancouver. I've been to that conference many times and I encourage you to go. And it's likely after our conference. So come to our conference first, but also consider that other one. Okay, we're gonna be switching our slide deck sort of in the background, and I'm gonna spend some time introducing our next speaker. So Will Heller is on the Actsafe team. He's been with Actsafe since 2019. And he's worked for 2 other BC-based industry health and safety associations. We're lucky to have him. He's a graduate of BCIT's Occupational Health and Safety program, which I highly recommend all of you check out if you're looking at some foundational safety courses. He's working towards his BC RSP, which is BC's safety designation. And he's worked with numerous organizations on their occupational health and safety programs and safety management systems. He specializes in performing arts and live events, but is also knowledgeable about the motion picture industry, and he delivers a lot of our training. So without further ado, over to you, Will.
Thanks very much, Trina. As you may be able to see, I've got a QR code up there. It's for the emergency response plan template that we developed with industry over the last little while. And so if you haven't got that open, that's okay. We're going to run through a quick orientation to that document. And as Trina alluded to earlier, we'll be doing a little bit of a game a little further down the road as well. And I just wanted to say thank you to Steve as well. His passion for life safety certainly shone through in that presentation. Yeah, so what we did was we developed an emergency response plan template, and it kind of speaks to what Steve was saying about usually written down. And what we found as a barrier for a lot of organizations is where do we start with that? And that's really what this is designed to be, is a start for you. If you start at the top, I've highlighted a couple of sections here. If you start at the top, we always like to start with a policy statement. As Steve mentioned, I think it goes back to the employer taking responsibility for planning for various emergencies. And as you can see, immediately after are the responsibilities of the other parties that are involved generally in a workplace. And we've left space to put different titles in that you might use depending on what your circumstance is. So again, we really want to help you to make this your document at the end of the day. Anything that you see in that kind of blue writing is yours to do what you want with. And in fact, even if you need to make some changes to some of that black, probably not going to be a huge impact. Perhaps you've got something already on your safety program that speaks to emergencies. And this is just going to give you some more information to make that plan more robust for you. So then once you take a look at the fact that the employers and the supervisors and the workers would have different responsibilities, depending on what the outcome of this plan would be, we want to talk a little bit about the risk assessment and the identification of hazards. This part of the template is basically paraphrased out of the legislative requirements. So if somebody is asking you about your emergency response plan, you want to make sure you hit a lot of those notes in your response. So as an example, one of the times where you want to have an emergency response plan that might impact your work is when an injured or ill worker cannot be accessed by stairs or elevator. There are some situations in our industry where that comes up, and sometimes it's tied in with what might be a fall plan, a fall protection plan, and a rescue there. And again, this kind of reinforces that same work. You want to be able to get to people in those instances. Another one I just wanted to highlight at the bottom of that list is where persons require physical assistance to be moved. Again, when this legislation applies, is largely to your workforce. And we have to recognize when we've got thousands of patrons, that might be something we need to consider as well, because without patrons keeping the wheels turning, it gets really quiet, as we saw in the last couple of years. So yeah, and it talks a little bit more about what procedures should look like, including drills, which Steve mentioned quite thoroughly and talked about. I love that tabletop exercise idea for groups that can't evacuate, 1,500 people on a Friday night. They can run some tabletops, and that'll help speak to that question. Speaking of questions, just a reminder, if you have questions as I'm going through this, fire them into the Q&A as you get them. So I'm skipping over the hazard assessment, the hazard identification and risk assessment part that's in that document for you. It gives you a brief. You can get that information in a lot of different places. I don't want to harp on that. So I'm just kind of moving on to what the 4 phases of an emergency are. If you look at it, mitigation and preparedness, those are things that happen before an emergency occurs. This is the thought and the planning process. The strength is in your own planning process. And then what happens after an event or during an event is called response and recovery, or business continuity. And all of these things and the planning for them will help you as an organization, as an industry, always to survive and succeed and get back up and running in as quick fashion as you can. The next little section of the document is a table. And it basically provides you an insight. The one that I cut out is kind of the example. So a hazard example, I think that Steve touched on, that does affect us here, or at least it might upcoming in the next few days, would be something like flooding. So that would be a hazard example. You can get those hazards from anywhere. I would suggest definitely involving your joint health and safety committee, your worker representative. If you don't have either of those, because you're a small organization, just have it at one of your meetings. Be like, hey, what kind of emergencies do you think that we can foresee and do something about? You want to take that information, figure out what your risk rating is. Again, use high, medium, or low to describe the risk rating of each of those hazards. Then you move on to the next steps, developing roles, running the drills, and so on and so forth to try and create an opportunity for improvement. I wanted to point out that you can use materials you already have. A lot of the questions we get are like, but we're on location and we're moving around all the time. Locations quite often will have maps of the location, and they'll have the muster point highlighted there, or it'll be used as a part of that toolbox talk before as people are arriving. And the same goes for festivals. You've got site maps available, or if you're in a building, you've got a fire safety plan map. And so let's use those materials. Let's throw them into our emergency planning, and toolbox talk occasionally would be great, or pre-job talk would be great. Other things you might have is an emergency contact list. It's also included in here. And the assignment of an emergency coordinator for many organizations is something that hasn't really been hammered home for a lot of people. So maybe that's something that you really want to consider. Anytime there's a need for evacuation, an emergency coordinator is something that we want to all be on the same page about. I popped up the QR code to play this quick game about how much did you pick up from what I just laid down. And so if you pop on there, I dropped in the thing. Don't fret if you don't get in. You can still play along at home. Just pick it in your mind. Drop a name in there. We got fabulous prizes, or at least bragging rights for the person who finishes in first. And I'm just going to move on about now. Here we go. Yeah, I like interactive stuff, and I'm hoping that I did a good job of conveying the message. We'll see how we did. I'm going to read the questions out. Sometimes there's a delay in how your cell phone or your device will pop up the question. Don't worry, you're not losing points if it takes a little bit of time. So I'll read the questions out so you can just focus on the answers. The first step in emergency response planning is write procedures for various roles. Use the Actsafe template, don't make changes. Buy emergency preparedness kits. Identify emergencies that may impact our business and colleagues, or determine the risk of an earthquake or zombie apocalypse. I see a few responses there. And the time is closed. Don't worry. We get more time. We're going to move into true and false later on. Yeah, identifying hazards, identifying the emergencies that may impact us is the first step. So well done to that group. We've got a leaderboard up there. My eyes are terrible. I got to turn around. Betty Boop, we're going to have a hard time reaching you with fabulous prizes. And we can see other participants in there. Great sources for emergencies to consider include, and there's a 10-second timer. I'll just leave you with it for the last. Okay, now we're getting more responses. That's great. More players in the game. And the time is closed. You know what? That was a trick question. You can get your emergencies from anywhere. That's okay. Consider it, write it down. We thought about that emergency. Determine risk on how much time you're going to spend on each of those emergencies. And I think the leaderboard is going to pop up one more time here. Betty Boop's still in the lead. Oh, and we've got a tie, actually. That's fantastic. A couple with 2,000 points and the leaderboard's growing. So there is competition. I think even at the bottom, there's only 3. Okay, involving Joint Health and Safety Committee or a worker representative in emergency planning is, while I stumble over my words. Let's see how we did. Responses keep growing. All right. It's important. Yeah, you're right. Involve your workers in every stage along safety. I love it. Fantastic. Emergencies which require written procedures, according to the regulation in British Columbia, include, this is a tricky one. All righty. The timer is out. I promise we'll move to true false and it'll be easier to respond soon. Yeah, you're right. Look at that. Times where workers wouldn't be accessible by stairs or an elevator. Great job, everybody. Okay, we're going to get the leaderboard a little less frequently now, but don't worry, the scores are still being tallied. We can use an existing or developed site maps and fire safety building plans as part of our emergency response planning. Here's a true false. Love it. All righty. Yeah, everybody nailed it. Yeah, let's use what we've got existing. Just keep improving. When assigning a risk rating to an emergency, preferred descriptors are, I covered this pretty quickly. That's right, low, medium, and high. That's the ones, those are the words we want to see. Okay, low, medium, and high. Is it Miranda? Miranda's still on top with Betty Boop. Just a little bit behind. My responsibilities related to emergency planning are the same whether I'm a worker, supervisor, or employer. Let's see what you think about that. There's quick responses. I love it. Trying to capitalize on the full points. Yeah, you got that right. It's false. There's different responsibilities for different groups. Thank you. 4 phases of an emergency. So this might be new content for a lot of people. Mitigation, preparedness, which happened before, response and recovery, which happened after. Is that true? Kind of gave that one away, didn't I? Holy cow. My passion for getting that knowledge to people. All right. Still 7% didn't pick it up. That's all right. No worries. It's time to be learning still. Okay, if there's a possibility of an emergency, an assigned person to coordinate emergency response is required by the regulation. Tricky, tricky. And the answer to that is true. Yeah, absolutely. If you need to have an emergency response, you want a coordinator. They can do things like head counts and notifying different groups like utilities if something happens. Lots of things you can work into that role. An emergency contact list can form part of our emergency response planning. Is that true or false? Oh, I better speed it up. The answer to that is absolutely 100% true. I think we've got one question left. Nope, not quite yet. After an emergency, we plan for folks that may need mental health supports, like trauma counseling. Oh, everybody's got an answer for this one. This is where a lot of this topic comes up. And I can tell you, either answer is okay. All right. You're part of the way, you're never really all the way. Just keep looking for ways to improve. So everybody gets points on that one. That's my favorite. I like it when everybody gets points. Look at this, we're tied. We're going to need twice the prizes. Emergency planning will help my loved ones, colleagues, patrons, if applicable, suppliers, and organization if an emergency occurs. And the answer to that is obviously, 14 people just nailed it right off the first 2 seconds. That's fantastic. We are going to shift into the Q&A section very quickly, but we do need to celebrate the persons on the top of the leaderboard. That's Betty, Boop, and Miranda. So if you just reach out through the chat to one of the hosts, we can get some contact information and start working that out. In the meantime, brag to all your friends. And the question and answer period is open. So that goes for whether it's template related or whether it's related to Steve's work, which is fantastic, or industry based. What do we got?
Hi, everybody. So spoiler alert, I was Betty Boo. I just, so Miranda, you get the prize. I obviously couldn't actually participate, but I also wanted to play the game. So thank you, Will, for that very informative presentation. We're really trying to just give you a taste here today. That resource is downloadable and free on our website. If you have any questions after this webinar, you can email or call the Actsafe office and reach any of our safety advisors. We have 4 on staff, and they can help you customize it for your workplace and help you fill in the blanks. So let me go through the questions. One was around temporary locations. And Will, I did hear you talk about that in your presentation, but I'm wondering if you can expand on how you might need to adjust your ERP if you're, going to a location for the film industry and you might be there for one day kind of thing.
Yeah, so that is a really common thing that comes up, and it's like, how much can we get done? What you want to do is really build a case that you are planning for different emergencies. When you get, from the time you send locations in to do kind of the research regarding the site, oftentimes there are site maps developed. Sometimes site map developed and a muster point is all you've got, then that's great. You can still post that nearby so that people who are arriving for that partial day can take a quick look and understand where they're going. Maybe there's a bit of information there regarding how to notify workers. Hey, time to get out of the zone and hit that there, hit that muster point. So do what you can with what's available at first, and then try to look for ways to improve would be the answer to that.
Thanks. So another question, will the template be available via email? Yes, everybody who registered for this webinar will be receiving an email that will include the recording of the webinar, the template, the resource, as well as the survey. Can we see the info panel that Steve provided about emergency kit contents? What was the info panel?
Actually, if you're looking for emergency kits content, we've also got an info sheet online through Actsafe. Through the template at the bottom, the last page is a lot of resources, and you could just click right on there and it'll take you straight to the info sheet. It gives you personal business ones. I think maybe even one in vehicles, I'm not sure. Same thing with things like first aid assessment, if you want to do that. There's a lot of resources there regarding emergencies to take a look at.
Fantastic. And the last question is actually just positive feedback about the webinar. So thank you for that. All right, so we will wrap it up. Again, if anyone has additional questions or needs help filling out that form, please contact my team. They are here for free and and can customize it to your workplace. They're highly specialized in all the different areas of this arts and entertainment industry. So I have two final slides. The final one is all the contact details. The middle one is pitching our next webinar. So thank you for attending this one. Our next webinar will be on December 9th at 10 a.m. Its registration is already open, and it's on bullying and harassment prevention specific to supervisors in the BC Arts and Entertainment workplace. We do have a course at Actsafe on bullying and harassment prevention in general. I really encourage you to take it. Our webinar will just be specific to supervisor and the supervisory role with that. Final slide is all of our contact details. So my team is available Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 to answer your questions, help you register for a course, whatever you need. You can connect with our motion picture team through that email you see there, or our performing arts and live events safety team through that email. Steve's contact details is at the very end. Yeah, like I said, complete the survey. You have a chance to win a Skip the Dishes gift card. And you will all be receiving the recording, the survey, the ERP template, and follow us on our socials and subscribe to our newsletter. That's the best way to keep in touch. Thank you very much for your time. Bye.